With a body tool, you're going to grab these pins and just pull up on them. There's 2 of them. And you can grab this, just slide it right out of the gearbox. So we're going to take this side shroud down on the driver's side, 12mm socket. Got a body clip right here. Squeeze the tab, pull that out of the way. Then we have one more up here in the fender well. And now you can do the same thing to the other side. Now that the shroud is out of the way, you can see the actual drain plug for the radiator. Phillips screwdriver. Make sure you have a catch basin down below. And watch your eyes. So now we lower the car again, catch basin still under the radiator, and we're going to take this cap off and the coolant should really come out then. And there it goes. Pair of pliers, I'm going to take the upper radiator hose, clamp, take that right off. Also going to take it off the engine side to give us more room. It's a bit corroded on there, it's very typical cars with age to them. So I'll just take my pick, try to break free the corrosion on that aluminum. I think we're going to replace that hose. So now we're going to take the lower radiator hose off. This is a 8mm socket for this clamp or a flat blade screwdriver. Now we're going to take the lower hose off of the thermostat housing. Be careful for coolant that probably should slip out a little bit. I'm going to remove the upper bracket for that covers the belt, drive belt, 10mm socket. Loosen up the alternator back bracket to pull this out of the way. That's a 12mm socket. You can lift that right up. Now we're going to loosen up the alternator belt tensioner, 12mm socket. Same 12mm. Now we can remove the belt. Now we're going to remove the belt, AC belt, 12mm socket. Loosen up the pulley nut and then the adjuster. Now we can slide the AC belt right off. Now we're going to take the adjuster off the block. I'm going to take the end driver's side bank cam cover off. It's 3 bolts holding it on. So now I'm going to take a 22mm socket, put it on the harmonic balancer crank, and I'm going to spin this till this mark right here in this cam lines up with that notch in that. And don't use a harmonic balancer marker. Don't zero it out because the markings actually, see here's the harmonic balancer mark. Don't aim for 0. You just want this cam to line up. Then we'll take the harmonic balancer off and you'll see the actual cam gear will mark differently on the internal part. I'm going to put this belt strap tool to hold it. There's a lot of different ways to do these. A lot of people use 22mm socket. now we should just be able to wiggle this off. Usually just pull off my hand. See, it's got a little bit of a wobble to it. Don't take a metal hammer to it, only take a rubber mallet, because this will all break off very easily on this. I'm just lightly tapping it just to loosen it up and pulling on it at the same time. If you use a pry bar, you'll break the ears off on the side of the harmonic balancer and possibly damage the cover. So it's just a matter of just working it. Just keep working it and patience. Now we're going to take the rest of the timing cover off. I'm just going to start up top here and work my way around 10mm socket. You might find the bottom ones corroded because they get all the weather plus the heat from the exhaust. You might have to take these oxygen sensor connectors off, squeeze that tab, and pull. And the back one. Now that bracket is in the way from this cover coming off. I'm not going to dismount it. Instead, I'm just going to take my pliers. I'm going to see if I can just manipulate it a little bit out of the way, like that. So now we're going to remove the belt. Before we do that, we want to make sure all our marks are lined up correctly. So we have that notch there to that notch in that back of that timing cover. And then we're going to go over to the passenger bank. We have this line lined up with the marking, just a straight line right there in the back of that block. And then the crank. And if you look, that little notch right there, there is a notch. That is supposed to line up with it. So the last person that did this timing belt, they were off almost a full tooth, easy to fix. So I'm going to remove the belt where it is because I want the cams where they are. I'm going to take the tensioner, remove the tension off of it, and slide the belt off. So I'm going to take my straight pry bar, straight edge, and I'm going to use the side angle of it. I'm going to go right onto the water pump into the bottom of this hydraulic tensioner. And I'm going to pull up slowly and let that piston compress. It takes the tension off of the timing belt. And I have a 5/64 drill bit in my hand. And I'm going to put the smooth shank side in and line it up, go all the way through. Now I can release that, and you'll see the belt has no tension on it, and the piston is being held. So now when I take this off, it doesn't move any of the pulleys and misalign my alignment. 14mm socket, and I'm just going to reverse this. Carefully remove it. So this is what I did with my drill bit. Slides right through and it holds that piston down. When you see any residual oil like that, always replace the tensioner when doing a timing belt, because if that hydraulic fluid is leaking, you cannot take a chance of this releasing tension on that belt. So now I'm just going to take the belt, slide it right off. I'm going to remove the timing belt pulley, 14mm socket. Now I have a catch basin underneath the water pump, and I'm going to remove this bypass hose. A pair of pliers. Move that clamp up there. And I'm going to carefully just grab it and twist it. And now I can pull that off the water pump. So there's 6 bolts holding the water pump to the block. We can start here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6. They're all a 10mm socket. I'm going to undo the bottom ones first. Now I'm just going to hold it, see if I can give it a tap. Now we're going to clean our surface where the water pump sits. I have a little razor blade. Just actually pull it so that way I don't gouge the aluminum. And then I'll clean it up with a little bit of sandpaper or emery cloth. I'll get all the heavy stuff off this way. So now we're going to take the thermostat housing off the old water pump and transfer it over to the new one. 10mm socket. Grab a pair of pliers. The water pump does come with a new thermostat gasket, so you can choose to replace the thermostat or use the old one, but it will come with a new gasket. So now we can, I like to do this little trick that I learned way back, just to confirm, because sometimes bolts are different lengths. So replace them one at a time, and then there's no confusion. And if you want to take one out, you can take one out and clean it and just reinstall it. Like this one right here, I will definitely take back out and clean that head. But now we're going to actually take the thermostat housing and go clean that up. You don't want any of that corrosion there. Wire wheel brush or some sandpaper. So this is the importance of cleaning your items before you reinstall secondary pieces. So see, all the aluminum is pitted all the way around, severely actually. That is not reusable, so I have to go get a new thermostat housing. And I'll probably get a thermostat at the same time. So now I'm going to install the side seal that comes with the water pump. Just got to push it right into the groove there. It should stay. And I'm going to put the thermostat housing on once the water pump is installed. Now I'm going to install the gasket. It's another good reason to leave the bolts on, because you can use them to line up the gasket holes. Do not use any RTV or gasket sealant on any paper gasket. It'll only destroy it and it will leak. I've cleaned my surface. Let's give it one last wipe. The coolant is right there on the edge, but it'll be fine once it's tightened up. Okay, so you got to guide that rubber piece in right below that notch. Hold the gasket. Always go side to side, even when tightening or just hand tightening. Torque specs for the water pump is 9 foot-pounds. I'm going to start at the bottom. And I'm going to go in a crisscross pattern. Then one last time. Now I'm going to reinstall the bypass hose. Try to line it up with right where it was. Now I'm going to install the timing belt tensioner pulley. Start it by hand, bottom it out, and the torque specs is 29 foot-pounds. Now I'm going to install the timing belt pulley. They call it a G2. And this is going to be to 26 to 31 foot-pounds. You can hear the bearing. Needs to be replaced. There's the new one. Just going to snug it up before I torque it. So in reference, when I talk about the timing belt tensioners, or the pulley, shall I say, this is G1, G2, and G3. And this is the timing belt tensioner right here. And that's the pivot bolt. So we're going to torque them all. They get torqued from 26 to 32 foot-pounds. I've already done this one. And now I'm going to torque this one. And I just have to replace that one. Snug it up. Now this is the crank sprocket, and I'm going to pull this off. And there's the front crank seal, and I'm going to replace that. So I'm going to pop the seal out. There we go. It has a rounded edge on it, so it doesn't damage the inside of this oil pump. So now I'm going to install the new crank seal, and I'm just going to slide it right on there. Sometimes they will push just with your thumb. You just don't want the inside here to roll over where there's a spring. So I'm going to take a little brass punch and tap it in. Always make sure you get it right on the edge. Okay, then you take your finger and you feel for it to make sure it's seated all the way around, and it's not seated on this side flush. Perfect. Now I can reinstall the crank sprocket, and it slides right on. Now we're going to install our timing belt. Make sure all the pulleys have no dirt or any debris on them or grease. Everything looks pretty good. Your belt will come with lines. You have a center line, a left side, and a right side. The arrows point in the direction the engine will run. The engine runs clockwise on this. So we're going to line this middle mark right up on top of that right there. And you're always on a timing belt on a Subaru, you're going to go counterclockwise to install. This pulley on this cam moves very freely, so don't be afraid to pull that belt taut and then go like that. Bring it around. You've got to keep pressure on it at all times. I keep my thumb on the crank also because that will slip right off. If you look at that, that is almost off. But get some tension there. There we go. Lift that pulley up. I'm not going to lie to you, I've never had this work as smooth as it looks. So now I slip the belt on, it's ready to pull the pin. Make sure your marks are all still lined up, and then you pull the hydraulic pin right out. Save this if you plan on doing a timing belt again in the future, and you can use this instead of a drill bit to hold that tensioner. So I'm going to install the crank bolt, just hand tight, and then I'm going to turn it over by hand like 3 rotations and confirm that everything's still lined up. Make sure that the belt seats properly before I put the covers on. That's a 22mm socket. And every time it gets rotated, have no fear the white lines will move and they won't line up correctly again. So you just have to use the marks. See my water pump The belt was off just a hair. Now it's moved, it's centered itself perfectly. Lined up, lined up, lined up. Now I'm going to take the bolt out, and I can put the covers back on. Okay, so now I'm going to install the timing cover, and this is that bolt that goes right here. It's the only one that doesn't have a shank on it. The rest of them have a spacer shank on it. So I'm going to install that one first. Now I'm just going to snug them all up. Just let them bottom out. Don't crank on them too much because that will just crack the plastic. Left outer bank. Just snug those down. Now line the harmonic balancer up with that keyway. It's about 6 o'clock. Right there. On Subaru, the crank bolt, they want you to oil the threads and all the way up to the actual flat washer. With that's just engine oil. Then you're going to install it. And you're going to torque it to 33 foot-pounds and then an additional 126 foot-pounds. Snug. Now let's get our torque wrench. I'm going to install my belt wrench again. It's going to go the opposite way. I'm going to torque the first passing at 33 foot-pounds. And then it's an additional 126 to 134 foot-pounds. There we go. So now I'm going to install the pulley bolts. That's a 12mm socket. Torque specs is 28 foot-pounds. Now we can put the belt on. Make sure you get plenty of room there. Slide it over the AC compressor. Make sure it lines up on the crank and the pulley. And then I'm going to snug it up. Now we're going to tighten this one. And tighten this to 11.8 foot-pounds. I'm going to put the alternator belt on around the power steering pump, then around the alternator. Now we can snug that up. Make sure it sits in all the grooves. Before I torque that down and tighten that down, I'm going to put the bracket back on and put it between the two washers. Put the fat washer against the alternator. That one like that. Bolt goes there. So now I can tighten this up, the brackets in place. So I'm going to torque up the alternator adjusting bolt, and that's 22 foot-pounds. I'm going to do the back bolt at 22 foot-pounds. putting the last back cover on. Line that one up. That's a 10mm socket. Socket. Now we're going to install the upper radiator hose. I got a new one, like I said I wanted to, and I cleaned up that hose outlet that was all corroded. I'm going to put it on the radiator first. And I'll connect it down here on the actual hose outlet. Make sure you bottom it out on that little aluminum tab. My new hose clamps are 8mm. I'm just going to snug them up. Real like that, and then the upper hose clamp. I'm bottomed out right onto the radiator housing. I don't want it too far that way. I want to make sure the clamp is centered. Now we have a new thermostat and a thermostat gasket. There's no distinctive top or bottom or inside or out of this gasket. You just have to ride it, put the steel part of the thermostat in that little slot, slide it over, and then bring it all the way around, just like that. You want your end result to look just like this. There we go. Make sure it's seated on both sides. I usually just go like this real quick. And if you're wondering what this little brass pin that opens and flops around is for, that is a vent. You want that always at 12 o'clock. I'm going to install that with it straight up. And that helps the system burp, which if you've ever had an AC system vapor locked or air locked, it's not fun. So you're just going to press it and seat it in all the way around and make sure it seats. Now this is the old thermostat housing, and this is why I'm replacing it. Made out of aluminum, but see all those pits? Those are little crevices that are they're pretty deep. You can't see with the camera maybe, but trust me when I say they're deep. And what happens is the hose will go over and it will seep through, and eventually it rots from the inside. You'll see markings inside there. And that corrosion from that aluminum just starts to go through, and then you'll have a leaky thermostat housing. So a new one, pennies on the dollar. It's worth replacing at this point. Got the two mounting bolts. Slide them right through. Those are a 10mm socket. Then I'm going to bring it right up, line it up, the bottom one, hand start it. And then get the top one. Do the same. I'm going to bottom them both out equally, and then I will tighten it down. I've been snugging this back and forth in equal pressure because I don't want to put one ear down more than the other. And once it bottoms out, I'm just going to turn it a quarter turn. Now we're going to install the lower radiator hose. Make sure it's all the way up against that radiator. And the same with the thermostat housing. You want that all the way seated. Bring that clamp around. Now I'm going to hold it right in the center of the line of the hose and 8mm socket. And then make sure you tighten up your radiator drain plug. Make sure it's snug. And now we can put our fender skirt back up in. There we go. So the bolt goes in this housing right here. Pinch pin clip in the actual fender well first to hold it up equally. And then this last push pin. And then we'll tighten that up. 12mm socket. Do the same to the other one. Now that everything's all sealed up and ready to go, we're going to top off the coolant, or fill the radiator, shall I say. I have this funnel because it helps burp the system. So as it's idling and running, it will take the air and bring it up to the top and burp it so you don't make a mess. And it helps make sure your system is properly burped. Once the vehicle has reached full temperature and the bubbles have stopped, top off the fluid, put the radiator cap on, and you're clear to road test.